Next, we're going to take a look at the midpoint of a line segment. First of all, a line segment is a part of a line between two specific points, including the points themselves. So you can see two line segments in example 1, A and B. For example 1, we want to determine the midpoint of each of the following line segments. So starting with the first line, if it starts at 0 and goes to 15, we see that the midpoint occurs here at 7.5. And to get that answer, we just take 15 and we can divide that by 2, which we know equals 7.5. For B, we're not starting at 0, so what is the midpoint between 7 and 22? The best way to find the midpoint between two numbers is to take what's called the average. The average and the midpoint are equivalent to each other when we're dealing with 2 points. So if we want to find the average, we would take 7 plus 22 and we would divide that by 2. Well, we know 7 plus 22 is 29, and then we want to do 29 divided by 2, so that's 14.5. So you may have done a different way to get this midpoint, but this would be the most efficient way. Take the average of the two numbers, 7 and 22. So now let's get into some geometry. What if I want the midpoint between A and B, which are now 2 points? So let's plot these 2 points. So point A is at 1 and 8, and point B is at 5 and 2. Connect these points with a line. We now have a line segment, which is just part of a line. If I want to find the midpoint, using the diagram, I could just count squares and I can see if I go 2 over and 3 down, I hit this point, and if I go 2 over and 3 down, I get to that end point. So I do have a midpoint right here, and the midpoint, if I count over, is 3 units to the right and 5 units up. But let's say we don't want to use a graph every time. What we can do is take the average of each of the components. So let's start with the x component. If I look closely, I see that I have two x values, 1 and 5. Let's take the average of those two values. If I do 1 plus 5 and I divide it by 2, I see that I get an x value. That's 6 over 2, which equals 3, which matches my graph. Similarly, if I take the average of the y values, so now I take 8 and 2, I do 8 plus 2 and divide it by 2, that's 10 over 2, which equals 5. And that matches my graph again. So we see we have a midpoint, that's 3, 5. And that is how you find the midpoint of a line segment on an XY plane. Given any line segment with endpoint A, x1, y1, and B, x2, y2, the midpoint is the point with the coordinates, and we can see here the average of the x's, x1 plus x2 divided by 2, and the average of the y's, y1 plus y2 divided by 2. So again, if we want the midpoint, we just take the average of the x's and the average of the y values. Let's go to an example. Let's determine the midpoint of the line segment with endpoints 5 and 7. So there's 5 and 7, and 4, negative 5. And here's 4, negative 5. I want to find the midpoint of this line segment. So let's do it without the graph this time. Let's start with the x's. If I want the average of the x's, I'm going to take 5 and 4, add them up, and divide by 2. So I get 5 plus 4 over 2, That's 9 over 2, which is 4.5, or 9 over 2. Let's take the average of the y's. So the y's we see are 7 and negative 5. So I get 7 plus negative 5 over 2. That's 2 over 2, which equals 1. So this tells us that we have a midpoint that is 9 over 2, or 4.5, comma 1. Let's go see when we plot this. If I go over to 4.5 and count up 1, I hit that point right there, and that is indeed the midpoint of K and L. So again, we're just taking the average of the x components and the average of the y components, and that'll help us find our midpoint. Let's change the question around now. Let's say we want to find an endpoint, knowing the midpoint and one of the other endpoints. So first let's plot this. We know that one endpoint is at negative 2 and 5. We'll call that A. And we know that the midpoint is at 1 and 3. We'll call that M. We need to find the other endpoint. So far we know half of the line. So we need to find the other half. A quick way, if you have a graph, is to count squares. So I go 2 down and 3 to the right. I can continue that pattern, 2 down and 3 to the right. That'll be our other endpoint, say B. So we can do that with a graph, but how do we do it algebraically? So let's start with using the average concept again. There is the x for the endpoint, there is the x for the midpoint. Remember, the x is equal to x1 plus x2 divided by 2. Remember, the x1 and the x2 are the endpoints, and we only have one endpoint. So this here we'll call x1. The x without the number on it is the midpoint, so we're going to call that x. As well, we know that y is going to equal y1 plus y2 divided by 2. And we have these two y values. The first one being an endpoint, so that's y1. And the second one being the midpoint, so that is the y. So all we're going to do is sub these values into the corresponding equation. So for the x, we'll take the x from the midpoint, that's 1. We know one of the endpoints is negative 2. And then we don't know the other endpoint, so that's x2. And we divide it by 2. Let's get rid of the 2 from the bottom. So we're going to multiply both sides by 2. And we end up with 2 equals, these two cancel because 2 divided by 2 is 1. So we get negative 2 plus x sub 2. If we add 2 to both sides, we now have the endpoint value. So let's see what we get. We get 4 equals x2. Now let's go to our graph. Notice our graph here, that value for b, if we count squares, is 4, 1. So we got the x value right. We've got the 4. Let's try it with the y component. Let's sub in our values for y. So we see from the point that we see from the point that y is 3, y1 is 5, because that is from the endpoint. The other endpoint we don't know, so that's y2 divided by 2. Following the same steps, I'm going to multiply both sides by 2 to get rid of the fraction here, because this 2 and this 2 divided by 2 is 1. But 2 times 3 is 6. And on the right side we get 5 plus y2. If we minus 5 from both sides, we end up with our answer 1 equals y2. So putting the x and y together, we have that point B is 4 and 1, which is what we see from our graph as well. All right, last thing I want to talk about is applications using the midpoint. The first application we want to look at is what's called a median line. And a median line joins a vertex of a triangle to the midpoint of the opposite side. So a vertex is like the corner of the triangle. So here's vertex C, and here's the midpoint of the opposite side. So that dotted line there is what we call the median line from vertex C. And we could also create a median line from vertex B. It would look something like this. And we could do a median line from vertex A. It would look something like this. And in fact, all three would join at some point, but we're not going to talk about that today. So let's look at how to find the equation of a median line. There's 3 steps to do this. First step, we need to find the midpoint. And you have to find the midpoint of whatever side you need to use. So that's step 1. Once you know the midpoint, you can find the slope of the line. So you can find the slope of this line here. And once we know the slope, we can get the y-intercept. So with the midpoint, with the slope and the y-intercept, you'll end up with some equation y equals mx plus b, which will be the equation of that median line. So let's look at an example and let's try to find the equation of a median line. So example 3. We're going to determine the equation of the median line from vertex A in triangle ABC if the coordinates of the vertices are A, -3, -1. So there's A. B is 3 and 5. And C is 7 and -3. Let's connect those lines together. So there's A to B, A to C, and B to C, which forms our triangle. We want the median line from vertex A. So we want to start from vertex A and get to the midpoint of the opposite side. So as we said in step 1, to find the equation of the median line, we need a midpoint. And for this example, we're going to need the midpoint of BC. Why BC? Because we're starting from vertex A and we're trying to get to the midpoint of the opposite side. So let's find that midpoint. So using the points B and C, we're going to find the average of the x's and the average of the y's. So let's start with the x's. The x's are 3 plus 7, and then we're going to divide them by 2. And 3 plus 7 is 10, divided by 2 gives us 5. We take the average of the y values, so 5 plus -3, and again we're going to divide by 2. So 5 plus -3 is 2, 2 divided by 2 is 1. So we find the midpoint of BC is going to be 5, 1. So let's go check. If I go over to 5 and 1, fits nicely on this triangle. There is the median line from A. But we want the equation of the median line. So we've drawn it, now let's come up with an equation. So to find the equation of a line, first we need the slope. And we need the slope of the line, and the line is AM. So from point A to point M. Remember that A is -3, -1, and we just found out that M is 5 and 1. So the first thing is we need the slope. The slope of AM, remember, is delta y over delta x. Taking the two y's, so I'm going to start from the M, so 1 minus -1. And then subtracting the same way, 5 minus -3. If we do the subtraction, I get 2 over 8, which is equal to 1/4. If I look at my graph, I could check that. If I go up 1 and over 4, that looks correct. The green line has a positive slope, and we saw that our slope is 1/4. So now we have part of our equation. We know that y is equal to 1/4 x plus b. Now we need to find the y-intercept, and in order to find the y-intercept, we need a point on that line. Lucky for us, we have 2 points. We have -3, -1, and 5, 1. So we're going to use one of these points. I'm going to use 5 and 1. So I put 1 in for y equals 1/4, 5 in for x, plus b. Remember that 5 is 5 over 1. So now I have 1 equals 5/4. 5 times 1 is 5, 4 times 1 is 4, plus b. I'm going to move the 5/4 to the left side, or subtract 5/4 from both sides. So I get 1 minus 5/4 equals b. Remember that 1 is 1 over 1. The equivalent fraction would be 4 over 4 minus 5 over 4. And therefore b would equal -1/4. So now we know that the equation of this line is y equals 1/4 x minus 1/4. So let's go up to our picture and check. We should have a y-intercept that's roughly -1/4, and we should have a slope that's 1/4. So if you look at this, that's not bad. There's the y-intercept. And if I count 1 and go over 4, that's not bad as well. So it looks like our answer is correct, and that the equation of the median line is y equals 1/4 minus 1/4. Try these questions and see how they go.